last week we got together. We finished up chapter 1, which is a good thing. We're moving on in pretty good pace. And we are going to continue reading in Galatians chapter 2. In last week's session, we continued with a bit of a personal history that Shaul was sharing with his disciples in Galatia. Not only does he tell his history, and it does sound like a history lesson, to introduce us to the events that happened in his ministry in an order which they occurred, but he also wants to educate us about really what happened, how his walk of faith occurred. This is what's important to him, is to show how he was walking out his calling. And it's not an easy walk, as you could hear even from his story. See, he urges Galatians not to take a detour. That's the message of his book. You've started in this path, continue in this path. Don't take a detour. Don't try to walk off the trail. You began under my teaching. I gave you this good news. Trust me, what I told you is true. Stay the course. Even though somebody else comes in right now and maybe they're telling you a message that sounds more appealing, do not get sidetracked. I mean, that's his message. And that's what he's trying to show through his personal history of how difficult it was for him. He had plenty of chances to go off course and get sidetracked as well. So that's our previous chapter. We began this journey, and now we're continuing with Jerusalem. In the first part of chapter 2, we learn about Shaul's visit to Jerusalem. And of course, he recounts more history for us. As I said, this is not just history. This is part of his spirited defense. What he's trying to do is to defend his good news, his mission, his vision that God was doing in the world. This is how he sees things, and for him it's prophetic and important. That's what he's trying to open up to us. Well, once again, for him, the Gentiles were part of God's plan, part of what Hashem was doing in the world at that time, and that is why he writes this letter to disciples in Galatia. That's why they're so important to him. That's why he's fighting for them. That's why he's contending with this teaching. For him, they play a big role. So chapter 2 begins with these verses. Let's go and read the first 3 verses and then pause for a moment. After an interval of 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along also. It was because of a revelation that I went up and submitted to them the gospel which I preached among the Gentiles. But I did so in private to those who were of reputation, for fear that I might be running or had run in vain. But not even Titus, who was with me, though he was a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. Let's stop there for a moment and consider what Shaul is writing. There's some background here. So 14 years have passed. 14 years have passed from his last visit to Jerusalem. And in verse 2 we learn that he goes to Jerusalem this time. This time he has a very definite goal, a very definite idea, and a reason for the visit. First of all, he says that he went there because of revelation. Now, it's an interesting way of describing his journey, because when I look at the Greek there, I can't tell what exactly he means by because of revelation. Is it because he had a new revelation and he felt like he had to go to Jerusalem? Or is it because he's talking about that revelation that he had of what is the true, good news is of Messiah that includes the Gentiles? It's not clear. Is it the revelation he received from God that compelled him to go to Jerusalem and verify the things that he had saw and understood? Or was it a new revelation? I can't tell for sure. But regardless, this is a good idea to go to Jerusalem and verify with those disciples who have heard Yeshua teach and knew his message firsthand, personally. So he's doing the right thing by trying to check the things that the Lord revealed to him. So he says, because of revelation, he went up. By the way, notice, he went up to Jerusalem. Every time you go to Jerusalem, you go up. I've seen this many times. This is we call this little phrase right there. We call it a Semitism. This is how you know a Jew is writing. When a Jew is writing, you always go up to Jerusalem. You never go down to Jerusalem, even though he's in Syria. And it appears in Greek or Hebrew or any other language. It doesn't really matter, because that's conceptually what Jews think about Jerusalem, and that's how they write as they write as they feel. And so that's that kind of dead giveaway. So it says that he submitted to them, meaning to other disciples, the gospel which he preached among the Gentiles. Interesting. Right here we see very clearly the purpose of the visit. He goes to verify something. It has to do with the message that he's been preaching to the Gentiles. He says that he submitted it or presented it, whichever term you want to use, but basically he wanted them to hear the very things that he proclaimed to the Gentiles. And what we see here is we see Barnabas and we see Titus. And they come as witnesses because they can verify that this meeting actually occurred. And of course the Torah says you should have two witnesses, right? So, and just for balance, Shaul likes to do these kind of things. He took one Jew, one non-Jew, just to kind of see what's going to happen, I think. But they could verify his truthfulness, that he really proclaimed this message to the Galatians, and now he's telling that same exact message in Jerusalem, because you know how easy it is to go to Jerusalem, tell one story, and then go to Galatia, tell another story. So he's got witnesses both ways that can attest to his faithfulness. And now he's speaking in front of apostles in Jerusalem. And the message to the Jews was pretty clear to everyone. I think by that point, everyone understood that it is the message of the kingdom. It is the message of the reality of God's present reign with us. That's what Yeshua proclaimed. So I think the disciples understood it. I think a lot of people finally understood some of the implications of what Yeshua was saying. The second part, of course, there's the sacrifice of Yeshua that was revealed at the moment that happened, and that opens a whole new era of righteousness for Israel, or righteousness from a different vantage point. What Yeshua brings in is fullness. So everyone understands the message the way it has been proclaimed to Israel. But what is happening in this new prophetic turn of events that is occurring that has to do with Gentiles? Well, that's not what everybody understood. See, people didn't have so much of a clarity of how Gentiles have anything to do with any of that. You see, in Jerusalem, the congregations and the apostles pretty much understood what they were supposed to do. They were following the commandments of Yeshua. They just didn't quite see fully how Gentiles fit into that. And this is where Shaul comes in. And frankly, we talked about Jews being ethnocentric. If one is ethnocentric, you won't even think so much about these matters, because you look at the world through the prism of your culture, and your priorities and your issues. And so while Gentiles coming to know the Lord would be seen in a very positive light, I mean, think from a Jewish perspective, these idol-worshipping, godless people are turning from their evil ways and embracing our God of Israel. How can that be bad? Of course it's good. But no one like Shaul saw the prophetic role of Gentiles in these events. They did not see the role that they played, at that point in history, and they didn't see the future role. Shaul did. And so that was his revelation. That was his mission, is to bring that to the forefront. I think that's what the Lord has really caused him to do. And perhaps that is why this is so important for Shaul, to share the content of his message. What is being taught? What is it that he was entrusted with Yeshua's teaching? And now he's sharing with those who were entrusted with Yeshua's teachings from the beginning, personally. So, he received a revelation from God. Now he wants to check with others who really know God's truth. So, what better to know if you're mistaken, but to present one's understanding to those who were there, to those who heard from Yeshua himself, from the Master. So Shaul, adds right here in these verses that he did all this in private. because this was a delicate matter. Only a few people were present at this very meeting. And then he also explains why it was such a delicate matter. He says that this was for the fear. In verse 2, Shaul discloses to us something puzzling, actually. He admits that he presented the message to the apostles for their approval because of the fear that he was mistaken, and that all the work that he was doing among the nations was in vain. He says, did I run in vain? There's nothing about fear and doubt actually in Greek. So you're reading the translation. I don't know how close it is, how literal it is, but I just have to say that in Greek there's really not an idea there. That's how the translators chose to express the feelings that he was experiencing. But there is a Greek conjunction, mepos, which carries a negative connotation. So we get the sense of doubt. What it really means, it means unless. So what he says is, I want to present this to you unless everything that I was doing was pointless and meaningless. So you kind of get the idea of doubt, but to translate it as fear is a little bit more of a embellishment on the translator's part. So that's why he goes to submit his message, because there's a certain, I guess, he's not 100% sure. There may be something that he doesn't understand. If you think about it, it's really not a small thing for a man to admit doubt, especially for somebody like Shaul. Just think, few verses ago, we just read that he says he received direct revelation from God. His teaching is not from men, but from God himself. This is a man who was so sure. So how is it possible that here he says he has any doubts? Why does he have to go and check with others about his message if he's so sure he got it from God? Well, what actually happens here, we have to be clear that Shaul did not doubt the revelation of Messiah himself. He did not doubt his mission. He did not doubt what he saw, what he heard. What he most likely wondered about, what he most likely doubted, if there was anything, is that he wasn't absolutely sure about his interpretation, his understanding of that which was said to him. So who else is the better interpreter of the Master but those who lived and studied with him for all these years? That's why he goes to Jerusalem. He wants to make sure that he understood what was told to him correctly. And that's why there's that lack of assurance in his speech. So it's possible also that Shaul has encountered much opposition to his teaching. We can see how that's possible. So maybe he was thinking, could I be off track? Could I be mistaken? Maybe I did not understand what I was shown by God. So the questions in his mind were the kinds of questions, and I'm obviously extrapolating here, but he probably was thinking something like, will other disciples of Yeshua see what was revealed to him about the Gentiles in the same way he saw them? Or will they correct him? Will they accept his message, or will they find some kind of correction? Will they agree with his point, or will they oppose him? The question is his teaching consistent with what they were taught in their experience, in their time, with the Master? And of course, everyone has doubts. But it takes a big person to admit that one might be wrong. It takes a truth seeker, honestly. It also takes even a bigger person to be ready to change if necessary, if shown to be wrong. That takes even a bigger person. And Shaul took that chance by going to Jerusalem. He didn't have to go. He could have avoided it altogether. He could have kept wondering, doubting. But he took a bold step and he went to Jerusalem. And the risk, of course, was that he was going to be told, you're totally off and you're wrong. It was a risk. Now we understand why he held this meeting in private, because this is a very private matter to him. So now let's talk briefly about Titus the Greek. Shaul has not told his readers about the results of the meeting yet, by the way. The way you read this it kind of strings you along, unless you read it all in one big chunk. But if you like kind of read it verse by verse and you think about it, he hasn't told his readers what was decided at the meeting yet. Yet right there, he quickly mentions Titus. And he mentions something about Titus not being compelled, not being forced to be circumcised. Why tell us now? Why not finish the story first and then bring up Titus? And what does Titus's circumcision have to do with any of this, of him showing up in Jerusalem and verifying his message? Well, it's simple. Shaul is using the rhetorical move, as many people familiar with rhetoric, what he's trying to do, while in the midst of the story, he gives away his point by presenting a little piece of a tangible evidence for his case. So he's building a case. He's trying to develop a defense for his good news. And so what he does is he gives away a little bit of the information right there without even telling you the complete decision of this meeting. So, of course, Shaul's letter is written to Galatians to demonstrate that they did not need to become full converts to Judaism through circumcision. So, you see, that's the issue of circumcision. That's why Titus has not been circumcised important. From his perspective, following Yeshua connects one to Israel, but does not require one to become a Jew. That's what Shaul was thinking. At this point in the story, Shaul is around the original disciples, right? They were there. And they accept Titus into their midst as a Greek. That's his point. That's what he's trying to say. Not forcing him to be circumcised, even encouraging him to consider the option. No one says anything. No one does anything. No one is even suggesting anything of that variety of kind of suggestions. And what this demonstrates, so Shaul demonstrates that the apostles were in agreement with him and that the Greeks should remain Greeks if they become followers of Yeshua. See, that's his point. That's why he mentions Titus there in very quick passing. Now, perhaps Shaul inserts this into the story to silence the teachers who opposed him. Remember, he is writing this to argue with the teachers who are teaching a very different teaching from his own. Now, we do not know this for certain because we don't have their teaching, but it is probable that these teachers claim the Jerusalem apostles actually believe that the circumcision for Gentiles is necessary. And that maybe they even admonished it. And they had said, I've heard him say, I've heard him teach, I've heard him do this, Gentiles should be circumcised. That's what the Torah says. And that would partially be true. However, some may have, actually said those things. But they said this in the context of Gentiles who were a minority, living in Jerusalem, living in Israel. In addition, obviously that was the status quo for Torah. For the sojourners in the Torah who embraced the God of Israel, wanted to become a part of Israel. Since the ancient of days, since the days of Moses, the Torah allowed this. It encouraged this. So when the sojourner wants to be circumcised, he wants to celebrate Passover with you, circumcise him, allow him to celebrate Passover. Basically, allow him to enter into the people, allow him conversion. So Torah foresaw that possibility again. And so somebody can claim that, guess what? The disciples of Yeshua are teaching this thing because this is our standard way, and they promote this. So it is true, but it is partially true because there's an important issue at hand. Many people don't see this. To be a sojourner, one has to live within a Jewish community. Whether it be in Israel, or maybe in a place like Damascus or Alexandria, but not far away like the Gentiles. Like Galatians, who are so separated from the Jewish community. They're in a very different territory. How would a new convert learn what Jewish is if there are no other Jews around? And you got to remember that ancient people didn't have book learning at that point. Everything was oral. Everything, discipleship was something that you learned by living around other people and behaving as they do, as being a part of their life. Nobody learned from books at that time. Well, people did learn from books, but not to that extent at which we do now. I mean, you and I utilize a very different method of learning today. And that is such a second nature to us that we don't even question it. But you see, how could you learn anything about what Jewish is and how to live a Jewish life or Jewish ethics or morals or behavior or recipes or anything unless you have Jews around? And that's a problem for Galatians. So the truth is that a path of a proselyte, a circumcised convert to Judaism, was not the only one available to Galatians. And that's what everybody knew. But they just argued about it. See, they could be God-fearers, Gentiles who in some measure adapted their lifestyle to reflect the values of Hashem. Gentiles throughout history like this existed and have always done so. And didn't have to get circumcised or anything like that, but they just changed their lifestyle to fit in to this greater whole, the community of Israel. So, in my opinion, this is personal, you may disagree with this, that this is exactly what Shaul wants Galatians to be, not converts to Judaism, but God-fearers, who attach themselves to Israel God. And that was a viable option in the days of the Second Temple Judaism, because there were many God-fearers even living within the borders of Israel, not talking about outside the borders of Israel, where that was pretty much the only feasible option. So coming back to Titus. Using Titus' example, Shaul shows that his practice is not requiring circumcision, because his practice is not to require this. And circumcision would mean a full conversion to Jewishness. Two, he doesn't require circumcision for non-Jewish believers in Yeshua. And that apostles pretty much practiced the same practice. That they did not argue with him, they did not agree, they didn't have disagreements, they accepted Titus who he was, just as Greek as he was. And they accepted him the same way they accepted Barnabas, the same way they accepted Shaul. So there was no disagreement over that, and that's what Shaul was trying to demonstrate through bringing up this little comment about Titus. So this brings us into verse 4. So let's continue with verse 4. Verse 4 says, "But it was because the false brethren secretly brought in, who had sneaked in to spy out our liberty, which we have in Christ Jesus, in order to bring us into bondage. But we did not yield in subjection to them for even an hour, so that the truth of the gospel would remain with you." This is a short detour from the story, as you have probably realized. Remember, he's telling you history, and now he got to Jerusalem. Now he got to Jerusalem meeting. Now he's kind of started this little rabbit trail with Titus, and now he's explaining why is this important at all, why this issue of circumcision with Titus is important. He's trying to say, it has to do with these teachers who I'm arguing with. And so he goes on a little, couple of verses explanation before he comes back to the story of Jerusalem, and then he continues kind of his history. So he talks about the false brethren here in verse 4, and he calls these teachers false brothers. In other words, not really brothers. And the term itself is kind of vague, because Jews often called each other brothers in a covenantal way. A lot of times Jews addressed each other as brothers. But also in Greek, the term adelphos, it expresses closeness. It expresses commonality, not necessarily kinship, and not necessarily actual literal sibling relationship. So you can call people brothers in the big, sort of say, meaning of that word, rather than the narrow sense. So when we come across this term that he calls them false brothers, it doesn't really help us to realize what the identity of these teachers is. Are the Jews or the Gentiles? We don't know. It doesn't help us figure them out. One thing that we do learn is that they snuck in. They came with stealth. He calls them pretenders that came with a purpose. He had a very, very particular purpose in his understanding. They came to investigate. They came to spy out. And what did they want to see and spy out? They wanted to see freedom and liberty. There's something about these things. The idea behind getting intelligence on freedom, obviously from Shaul's perspective, is to bring them into bondage. These are actually a little bit of a pivotal verses, and I'll talk more about them in just a minute. But I want to direct your attention first at a couple of things in the text. Shaul keeps using plural here. Did you notice? He keeps saying we, and he keeps saying our. It's the plural pronouns, and it's hard to say whom he has in mind. Again, I'm looking at the original, I'm looking at the translations, and I can't figure out whom exactly does he have in mind when he says we or us. Are Galatians included in this collective pronoun? Maybe. What I think personally, that it is likely that he means himself and his co-laborers in Messiah. That's what he's talking about. Because if you remember correctly, the letter that Shaul is writing to his disciples is from him and from those who are with him. If you remember, in the very first chapter, in verse 2, Shaul mentions that the letter is not just from him, but also those who are with him, his co-laborers, his co-workers. There are other people who believe like he does and help him in what he's doing. So, it's possible that that's what that means, and I tend to believe that when he says us and we, he's talking from his perspective as a writer and those who are with him, not necessarily including Galatians. But it's a possibility. Either way, it can be seen. Now, verse 5 says that Shaul and his brothers, meaning us, right, did not yield to them because they believed that the truth Galatians were taught should not be modified. It should remain as it was. It says they did not yield even for an hour. That's obviously, it's a term, it's a phrase that means, he's exaggerating, not for a minute I agreed with you, or not for an hour, it's just a time reference. But all he's trying to say is we did not yield to them, we did not agree with them, because the truth you should continue having that truth which you had before. It should not be modified. So, now let's get back to this idea of liberty and freedom and bondage and slavery. These concepts, these words are actually quite important because on them hangs an understanding of this verse. And this is one of the pivotal verses. If one reads this verse thinking that Shaul is in disagreement with Torah, then it is possible to read that Shaul and his disciples have procured some liberty, that they were freed from bondage. One often presumes that they were freed from the oppression of Torah. Christians are all often taught to think that Torah is oppressive. But that would be very hard to do if one actually read what it's called Old Testament for themselves, right? And they will see all kinds of praises being sung to Torah. It's affirmed in such positive words, then the only way you can believe that is actually not ever crack open the Old Testament, right? So that's kind of hard. But people are taught these things, and Jews may have thought that Torah was difficult. Jews may have thought that Torah was hard to follow, but never saw Torah as slavery or as oppression. That is not the sentiment. Everybody knows that Hashem is not evil, and He gave us His Torah as a gift, as a blessing. So one may think these thoughts, as a person reads these ideas about liberty and freedom and slavery and bondage, one can think, okay, this is talking about Torah now. One can walk away from this verse thinking that these teachers seek to subject them to Torah and offer them circumcision, which obviously obligates one to the covenant, obviously now bringing them into slavery and bondage. So that's how one can interpret this verse. And though it is tempting for some to hear the verse to say this because of the present formulations of Christian theology, it should not be done. It's a mistake to read a much later theological thoughts into Shaul's words to Galatians. You have to remember, understand when these words were written. When these words were written, I guarantee you, those theological ideas did not exist. So it's hard and inappropriate to read those ideas into Shaul's words. It shouldn't be done. It's against the rules, so to say. And so we should not make this mistake, because this letter is not a polemic with Torah or with Judaism. This letter is a letter to disciples to help them understand spiritual truths. It's not trying to polemicize Torah or Judaism. That's something that happened in Christianity much later, and that's how the book began to be understood. So, liberty, freedom, bondage, slavery, key concepts in this letter. And Shaul will actually describe these concepts for us a little bit later in his own words, in his own explanations. He will go over and explain what he means by these terms. And the most important idea to grasp at this point is that he is not talking about grace versus law. That's at this point, that's if we understand this, then as you read further into Galatians, the ideas that Shaul puts behind freedom, liberty, slavery, and bondage, these words that are being used, will become self-evident. But if we set ourselves up in this verse, then we'll keep following that trajectory the next time we meet those terms and interpret them again in that light. So liberty, by the way, is a two-way road. People never think about liberty that way, but it is a two-way road. One is free from doing something at the same time as one is free to doing something. Think about it. One is free from, and then one is free to. Freedom works both ways. People don't ever consider it that way. And so what we have to do, we have to be a little bit patient for the sake of the text. At this point, not to jump ahead and not try to explain what freedom and liberty is, because I want you to see Shaul explain it himself, rather than me try to put the words right now into his mouth and then show it to you later. So I intentionally would like not to read too much into these words and understand these terms in their simplest, most rudimentary concepts, and really not read into what is it freedom to or from, or bondage to. That's not assign, sort of say, further meaning to them than that what these words actually mean. And obviously bondage and slavery is a lack of freedom, right? It's the opposite. It's the opposite of liberty, something that limits one from doing anything and everything he wishes to do. So, which obviously there's no absolute bondage either in that sense. Let's keep moving on through verses 6 through 10 right now, and as I said, we will come back to the ideas of freedom and bondage a little bit later on in another session when it comes up in the text, and it'll become much more abundantly clear, and then we'll return back to this verse and see it in that light. So verse 6, and he returns right here, but from those who were of high reputation, what they were makes no difference to me, that God shows no partiality. Well, those who were of high reputation contributed nothing to me. But on the contrary, seeing that I have been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter has been to the circumcised. For he who effectually worked for Peter in his apostleship to the circumcised effectually worked for me also to the Gentiles. And recognizing the grace that had been given to me, James and Cephas and John were reputed to be pillars, gave to me, Barnabas, the right hand of fellowship, so that we might go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. They asked us to remember the poor. They only asked us to remember the poor. The very thing I also was eager to do. So look at verse 6. What it says right here that should jump out right at you is that they contributed nothing. They had this meeting. Shaul tells his message. He explains what he believes. He explains what he's been proclaiming to the Gentiles. And they did not add anything to his message. They left it as it is. Now I know that as he returns to the story of Jerusalem, it sounds a little bit maybe disrespectful when he speaks that God does not show partiality and it's not important to him who is of high reputation, who is not of high reputation. That's just Shaul, and I think he's being a little bit emotional here. Because remember, he just talked about these false teachers, the circumcision, things like that. He gets a little bit emotional at this point, so he starts saying these things that may sound a little bit disrespectful to us. He's a human being like everybody else. At this point, what we have to notice is what he's saying, the main idea that he's saying. He says the apostles affirmed his message. They did not deem it odd. They did not deem it strange. They did not say, okay, what you're saying is good, the proclamation you have is wonderful, but you just need to add circumcision to your version of the good news. You just need to preach what you've been preaching, but also tell them to be circumcised. This is what he's after. He's saying they didn't add anything to my message. They said it was good as it is. So they contributed nothing to me. And then Shaul talks about being entrusted with the gospel. In verse 7, it says they recognized that he was entrusted, called by God himself to take this message to the nations. Just as Peter was called to the opposite mission, right? Peter is called to the circumcision, or the Jews. Hashem, Adonai, God himself called Peter to do this. And in the same way, it was appointed to Shaul to proclaim good news to the Gentiles. All he's saying is, I'm no different than Peter. Peter got a special calling, I got a special calling. The same way he was called to a particular group of people, I was called to a particular group of people. And we recognize that our callings are different. And we respected each other, and we did not have disagreement with each other. That's all he's trying to say here. And in verse 9, he says that the apostles, look at their names, Yaakov, Kepha, and Yochanan. They recognized the favor that was given to Shaul to accomplish this mission. Remember the grace. Grace means favor, right? Mm-hmm. Favorable. God was favorable to him that he allowed him to have this. This was a blessing that he was given in a sense. That's how the word favor is being used throughout the Bible. So let me mention a couple of things about the names now. I know this is a little aside from Galatians so much, but very briefly. I use the name Shaul all the time. I say Shaul, Shaul, Shaul. And many people are used to name Paul. Okay? I use Shaul out of preference because I want to stress his Jewishness. I do this on purpose. Because whenever people read him, whenever people see him, whenever people proclaim him, teach him, preach him, most of the time he is seen as, I don't know, St. Augustine or Thomas Aquinas or something. And so, deliberately, to spoil that image, I call him Shaul. On purpose. This is my personal preference. You see, but Paul is his other name, as much as Shaul is his name. See, he was given two names. He had name Paulos, a Roman name, and a Jewish name, Saulos. Paulos, Saulos. There's only one letter difference, by the way. You know, it's on purpose like that. Lots of Jews received more than one name in those days. And so there's this whole idea, this whole understanding that Paul was walking down the road to Damascus, and he had this vision, a conversion, and he stopped being Shaul right there in the moment and became Paul. You know, he changed his name and became a Gentile. Well, that's what it was in the Catholic Church. That's what people actually did. When people got baptized in the Catholic Church, if a Jewish person was baptized in the Catholic Church, they would have to forget their Jewish name and take on a Christian name. If If somebody was, some pagan and their name was a terrible name that had attachment to some pagan deity, and they become a Christian, that's what they're going to have to do. They have to change their name, have to give them a good, proper biblical name of some sort, that is more sanctifying. You see, some people get this notion that, Shaul was walking down the road, got converted, and became Paul. But that's obviously not true. That never happened. He always had both names. He continued to have both names throughout his life. And so, while I try to stress his Jewishness, on purpose, when I teach, when I explain things to people, he actually preferred using his Roman name with Gentiles because that kind of got him in. He was one of the guys immediately. So you see, he didn't have a problem with Jewishness because nobody had argued with him about him not being Jewish. But because that's the image being portrayed of him all the time, I kind of have to rely on that to use his Hebrew name on purpose. So you may notice that he's calling Peter Cephas in the scriptures. He calls him Cephas one time, and he calls him Petros another time. Sometimes in the same sentence. In the adjacent verses, you will see him being called Peter, Petros, and then he call him Cephas. So which one is it? Here's another guy with two names. What happened? It was a common custom to give a person a Hebrew name and a non-Hebrew name, especially for children in the diaspora. That was a very, very common practice that's being done even today. So, anyway, enough about names. Thank you for letting me have my little aside here, but I just wanted to clarify my terminology and to clear up a common misunderstanding for everyone's benefit. So as we read this, what we're continuing in verse 9 to see that the Shalachim, the sent ones, the apostles, gave Shaul and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship. In the end of all this meeting, they gave them the right hand of fellowship so that each party may fulfill the mission that they've been called by God to do. Right hand. Right hand is probably a term used for Galatians' sake. Jews actually did not have that particular custom. Jews did not do this so much. Socially speaking, Jews weren't real handshakers at that time in history in the Middle East. But a right hand of fellowship speaks for the purpose of Galatians probably because that is how Gentiles showed their friendliness to each other in agreement, is by shaking hands, and specifically the right hand. Why the right hand? Well, because the left hand is the dirty hand in the Middle East. And if you want to know what that means, you can ask me later. I'll explain. Whether this actually happened or not, whether the hands were being shook, is not really important. Because all that Shaul is trying to say is they left on friendly terms and they had their blessing. That's what he's trying to say. We had a meeting, nothing was added, we recognized each other, they saw the favor that I had, and now I'm leaving on good terms with their blessing. The requirement of conversion by circumcision was not added to his version of good news, and it was understood that his disciples in Galatia or anywhere else would not be, if they're Gentiles, would not be required to become Jews. There's only one request that they had for Shaul, and you saw that. They asked him for financial help from those who are coming to the knowledge of the God of Israel. And that is one way to show your solidarity. That is one way to show that you're standing together with God's people. Shaul himself had this concern for the poor of Jerusalem in his mind, and that's why he said that I was eager to raise the funds and to do what was necessary to do, because that's what was upon my heart to begin with. That's what I wanted to do anyway. So if they asked me this, I was already thinking it. So one would think that the story of Shaul that he's telling ends right here. The history telling, the history lesson is over. But that's not entirely true. Because in the next segment, as we would read next time, verses 11 through 21, they describe another historical event, and they launch us into a very central point of his argument in this letter to Galatia, to his disciples in Galatia. So in the next segment, we will see a little bit more of a history, but it gets even more complicated and a bit more theological next time.